Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For this episode of the show, we're joined by two guests, Brittany Mason, a data management analyst at the University of Florida, and Corey Callaghan, assistant professor also at the University of Florida in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. They were here to discuss their recent BioScience article, iNaturalist Accelerates Biodiversity Research, to which you'll find a link in the show notes. The article discusses the popular citizen science platform that I'm sure many of you have already used. So with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, James.
Thank you.
Okay, so I thought a first question might be just a little bit of an introduction to iNaturalist, and I was hoping you could describe what that platform is and what it does for those among our listeners who are presently uninitiated.
Yeah, so iNaturalist is a citizen science platform, so anyone can contribute. And what you do is you go and you take a picture of any like plants or animals that you see out in nature. You can upload it onto this platform, and then the application or website will tell you what it thinks the observation is. So it gives you a list of suggested identifications using computer vision, which is like machine learning. And so you get an initial idea of what the animal might be. And then you share this with the location information and the date and time information to a local community of naturalists. And then they'll be able to confirm the identification or suggest a new identification. And this teaches you what you're seeing out in nature. And then this data, once it reaches over 2/3 agreement on the species, it gets uploaded to a different platform called GBIF, which is a Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And this is where data gets aggregated and researchers can download it to use it for different research projects.
So that's interesting. So you're getting data that's, really being delivered by, in a large part, the general public, just folks who are interested in nature, out taking photographs and uploading it.
Yeah, how many people have contributed now, Brittany? I don't even remember. It grows so quick. Let's see. I'm just checking now. Yeah, over 3.7 million observers have contributed data across the world to the platform, it looks like.
That's an incredible number, and it leads me to suggest that our audience should probably already know about iNaturalist. So I have a question, because it's something that often comes up when we discuss citizen science. What is the quality of the data like? Is it something that you mentioned it being used in research? Is it something that's trustworthy? Does that sort of vetting step where you get the 2/3 agreement, does that kind of guarantee you, a set of data that is something that's actually worth looking at and using for, serious academic research purposes?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like you said, it's a question that comes up all the time. There has been some empirical tests that, the iNaturalist team have done, and I don't remember those numbers off the top of my head, but most taxonomic groups were over 90% accuracy in terms of those research grade status that Brittany was talking about. But I think, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here a little bit, but part of the whole point of this paper was really showing that the short answer to your question is yes, right? Like these data are trustworthy. Scientists are using these data more than kind of at least what I imagined.
And, when scientists make use of this data, is the reason for using this sort of citizen science data simply its abundance? Is it the fact that there's a whole lot of it and, it can save you the time, expense, and work of, doing site studies and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's, I don't think it's just the abundance. It's partly the spatial scale, right? Because you have this army of people out there that are contributing data, and this allows for data to be kind of gathered at very different spatial scales than what was feasible, just a couple of years ago, because so many people have joined the platform and are contributing data.
And I want to talk just in a moment about the specific numbers of records and things like that, and the number of studies, and because it's sort of a staggering number. But before we do that, in general, what kind of studies are conducted, using this data from iNaturalist and accessed from GBIF?
Yeah, so a lot of the data that you get from iNaturalist is observation data. So it's locational data for species. And you also get imagery data from there as well. And so a lot of people use this for species distribution mapping and ranges because it can be pretty reliable, because a large area of people are taking observations of things that they're finding. And this data can be used for different projects that are related to species distribution, whether that's for conservation or it could be for invasive species management as well. People are also using the imagery data to look at the biology or behavior of species. We can actually extract information from that. You can look at the pigmentation of species. You can also look at behavior like mating or foraging, or even extract habitat information from there as well. People are also looking at how people are interacting with the platform and how it's used in educational settings as well. So there's a really wide range of studies that use this data.
Yeah, how many different categories did we have that we tagged for, different types of analyses? And I remember when we first started this working on this paper, we like the first kind of time that we tried coming up with groups of categories, we had something like 16 different categories that we binned papers into. And then, we went back and forth and it's like, well, that's going to take way too long to kind of annotate, more than 2,000 articles. And so then we ended up with, what was the final number we ended up with, Brittany?
Yeah, so we had 7 categories plus another
Seven.
category. So
Right. So like we had to like, strategically work in order to figure out like how the heck are we going to accomplish this? But James, to go back to your question a little bit more, I mean, the way I like to think about this is like, and this is jumping ahead to the numbers a little bit already, but what I think a lot of this work means is that it's just really commonplace. And so 15 years ago, you'd have a master's student that went out to go, they wanted to understand the species distribution of some species. I don't know, a bobcat, right? Like just, fictional example. And so then that master student would design a 1 to 2 year study. They'd go do all these field sampling, and then they'd be able to say something about how that bobcat uses the environment. Now, I think what's happening now is that that's still taking place, but that same master student, in addition to their sites that they've sampled and like their kind of like rigorous, very structured design, they also go and grab the 150 observations or whatever it is on iNaturalist and integrate that into their analysis. And I think that that was one of the major kind of findings is just like how often this type of thing is taking place, right? I don't know if that helps answer your question about how what kind of analyses are being used, but I think that's an example of how these data are being used increasingly more.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly valuable insofar as it gives you a chance to look at, sort of the broader scale of the phenomena that you're seeing with, smaller studies.
Yeah, exactly. The other way it's used a lot is actually like a lot of like first record of this beetle in this state, right? Like a lot of like range extensions, which is related to species distribution, but not necessarily fitting models, but just really being able to say, hey, this is the first time that this species has been recorded to our knowledge in terms of like long as we've been studying species in this state or in this country or even in this county in some instances.
And let's talk now a little bit about, how much of this is happening. How many articles and, just looking at research outputs, for instance, are we tending to see that are using this kind of data?
Yeah, so I mean, I remember when Brittany and I first were discussing this, and I was like, Brittany, maybe you should check. Like, how much work would this be? And what was the number you came back with from Google Scholar?
yeah, we ended up getting over 10,000 articles initially from our search.
Right. And so a lot of those are just like mentioning iNaturalist in passing and not actually using iNaturalist. But that, like, I was like, I remember we had this discussion of like, oh crap, like, are we going to be able to do this? Like, is this feasible? But then, and then, maybe Brittany, like, how did we go about getting those articles down?
Yeah, so we searched for Google Scholar because it searches the entire article for the term iNaturalist. So I wanted to capture articles where they just mention it once in the methods. And so we ended up with over 10,000 articles to start. And then we also had like book chapters and conference proceedings and other papers in there. So we just wanted to look at scientific articles. So first we like parsed it down to just scientific articles. And then from those, we looked to see if they were using iNaturalist in their methods or if it was a review paper of iNaturalist. And then from that, we ended up with a little over 2,000 papers that we examined. And that been growing since we did this. So we did this in the summer of 2023. And now that I'm looking on Google Scholar with the same search, and there's over 20,000 articles. So it's like almost doubled since we did this 2 years ago. So literature is definitely increasing.
Yeah, it's really notable when you look at the figures in your article and you kind of see the slope of that curve as it just sort of goes almost straight up. Next, I had a really kind of nerdy literature type of publishing question, which is: do scientists tend to cite the records that they use in GBIF and iNaturalist, or was just this process of discovery on your side something that required a lot of really manual looking and going through however many articles by hand, more or less, and seeing what was in there?
So we did the more of the latter, right, where we had to do a manual approach, but there is an alternative, which we also explored in our paper, using the GBIF API.
And how does that work?
Yeah, so when people download iNaturalist data from GBIF, and this is a platform that groups together all publicly available data, so it's not just iNaturalist. And so people can go in and request data through GBIF, and then it gives you a citation that you're supposed to cite in your paper. But we found that this was not very common. There was about like a 10%, well, there's a 10% overlap between the way that we did it and GBIF citations. So some people just used GBIF and cited it, which might have included more than just iNaturalist data. And then there's other people that mentioned iNaturalist in the methods. And so there was a large amount of papers that used that GBIF citation, but there wasn't a lot of overlap between our two methods. So we had to do it manually because there are a lot of researchers that also will access iNaturalist data by using their own API of like iNaturalist API. And sometimes they're just looking at a couple records. And so maybe they don't need to download a bunch of records, but they see, oh, there's a new beetle species in this state. And so they just see that observation and they write a paper about it or use that observation with other data. And so that is a really great resource, like the GBIF citation, and that is a good way to track it. But we also have to do this manual searching as well to see like the entire scope of how iNaturalist is used in the literature.
So yes, the answer to your question is we went through a lot of articles and screened the abstracts, and then we manually went through just over 2,000 articles to kind of like extract the data of like what they were doing.
And then you classified that into the various categories, and that allowed you to kind of put forth the analysis that appears in the paper.
Correct.
So, I'm wondering now about the interplay between the scientists who are using iNaturalist data and, the community of people who are using iNaturalist to record data. Is there a back and forth mechanism for, the research community to either via iNaturalist or just by making the request in some other way to say, it would be really great if you took better pictures, did close-ups, or recorded this bit of information, or took a perhaps a wide habitat shot or something like that. Is there interplay between those two communities to ensure that the data that are being produced in this platform are actually going to be more valuable for research purposes and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and there's a lot of different answers to that question. I'll start broadly though in that. I think iNaturalist, the team there who, we're not really associated with, just to be clear, I think they've done a great job of allowing for this like globally applicable platform, but with local customizability, right? And so that local customizability kind of gets at what you're talking about. And so there's like these things called projects. And so projects are a way on the platform where people can, people being scientists or members of the public, whomever, can say, hey, I want to know about, the squirrels on this campus. So I'm going to create a project that only aggregates all the squirrel observations. And I'm going to make journal posts as a scientist and communicate these findings and communicate what I want. Maybe it's habitat shots, maybe it's something else, in order to get some of that interplay. But then there's also a lot more like granular level, right? Like a lot of scientists spend a lot of time, and I've seen many instances of, or I know of many instances, I've seen many instances of someone, some taxonomist is studying this rare snail, and then someone uploads a photo and they're like, oh, this is cool. Can you, collect some of these and send them to me? Or, where were you? I'm going to go check this out next month because I'm going to be driving by. Like this kind of thing, I think happens pretty often, and I don't know, we definitely didn't quantify that. And I don't know if anybody has, but I think it's a very complex question you ask with lots of different kind of ways that this interplay plays out.
I think that gives us a pretty good overview of it. I'm wondering about, where iNaturalist is used, and because, I know that, things like citizen science are, more popular in some communities than other communities, more popular in some countries than other countries. What what kinds of geographies do you see the most records from? Are there trends? Is it kind of global? Kind of what's going on with that?
Yeah, so in the United States, that's where most of the observations are coming from. That's like where iNaturalist started. But this is a global platform, so people can submit like all across the globe. And there are regional variations of the iNaturalist platform to communicate with those locals. And so we did look at how the iNaturalist data in different regions were being used in the literature. And we found that like in some regions, there was overrepresentation in the literature, meaning that the observations in certain countries, like in South America and Asia and Africa, those areas, the observations are more valuable and being used more in the scientific literature. This is especially important in regions where there's a lot of biodiversity that might be hard for professionals to capture, or maybe there's just not a lot of professional surveys happening in different regions. So there might be more of a reliance on citizen science. So there is definitely regional differences.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, a lot of people in the tropics and scientists, I mean, and engaged naturalists. I mean, iNaturalist is very quickly becoming the de facto field guide, right? Like that's the place to go to know, hey, is this random moth species? Is this a possibility in Brazil, or is it only restricted to the Ecuadorian Amazon, right? Like this kind of thing, I think is just absolutely, you know, becoming where it's, to be honest, we know a lot of like the general underlying distributions in many of the global north populations. But in some of these tropical countries that have such high diversity, I think it's just becoming increasingly important.
Yeah, and that sounds like it might even be a means of addressing the problem of the fact that many of the high biodiversity areas in the globe are those that may not have the financial or academic resources to make it easy for people to actively get out and do field work in those types of places.
Yeah, and just the infrastructure, right? Like just the infrastructure alone that they have provided allows for this. You can now draw a circle on a map anywhere in the world and get a list of all the species that have ever been documented there using iNaturalist. So this infrastructure is super, super valuable.
And just bouncing around a little bit, are most of the records that we see, are they charismatic mammals? Are they, or do we still get a large number of, people recording instances of small plants that may not even be flowering and things like that? What kind of biases exist or don't exist within what the records that are collected?
Yeah, so we did look at that a little bit in our paper about the iNaturalist proportion for like each group. And people are submitting plants a lot. There is a little bit of a bias there where you do have to get a photo of the species that you're documenting on iNaturalist. And so there might be some species that are a lot harder to get photos of, like really shy birds or organisms that mostly live underground. People might not be able to like find those or get images of them. But the species that are more visible, like squirrels, they're common in urban areas, they're more visible. We'll get a lot of observations of those. Plants are pretty easy for people to take images of. And so there is kind of a relationship between like ease of getting photos and the like if people are seeing them or not, or if they're like a pretty rare species that might be hard to find and track down.
But there's just this like there's such a diversity, right? As over 3 million people have contributed observations, and there's a really large diversity of of people that have their different interests. And so, like, yes, are there overall biases? There are, but there's some people that just love fungi and they just only submit observations of fungi, where maybe a lot of people, I probably shouldn't be picking on fungi, but like a lot of people might walk past it and not submit an observation. And so like there's kind of like it's just like, anything you're interested in there is there. And so the proportional amount of people that are interested in X, Y, or Z might differ, but it's all there. Like all flavors are there.
Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like if you have a critical mass of users like there is here, eventually you have a few people who are interested in whatever topic it might be that we won't beat up on, enough to get the observations so you could actually learn something from that data.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I'm wondering now, as kind of as we draw closer to a close, how do you view the future of this field, this area of study? Are there other potential uses that you've thought about that perhaps those of us who only have a more passing familiarity with the platform have not?
Yeah, I mean, I think This is a tough question because I think there's so much possibility that it's hard to fathom. I often think like we're still in the early stages, and iNat was only launched in 2008. Like, that's not that long ago, and it really didn't gain critical mass till a fair bit later. And so, what are we going to do with all this data? Even if those curves in the figure two in our paper kind of level off, starting in 2026, that's still just like millions of observations. And so thinking about how we can use those for conservation and biodiversity management and understanding biodiversity in space and time in kind of a more near real-time fashion, I think is really interesting and challenging. The other thing I'll add is there's a lot of really smart computer scientists working with these data and kind of trying to advance some of these more computational statistical methods like AI and being able to search for all photos of red flowers. Right? Like this is something that is coming very, very soon and is already kind of at our doorstep. And so I think the cop out answer to your question is kind of like, who knows? But it's fun to think about.
It most certainly is, and I would encourage our listeners who would like to do more thinking about iNaturalist and related topics to go ahead and read the article, which is linked in the show notes. And in the meantime, thank you very much for joining me. I've had a great time talking with you today.
Yeah, thanks for having us, James.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.